further ado, I am pleased to introduce our chair for this session, Chris Brown, who is Executive Chair and founder of Igloo. Chris, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Welcome back, everyone. I hope lunch catering was up to your usual standards. You joined me in my kitchen, despite the background, which is another part of the flat. So I hope you're all similarly comfortable. We've got some fabulous speakers this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them very briefly as we go through, and I am going to keep them rigorously to time. So I'll kind of leap in with a minute to go if I think there's a danger of overrunning. We've got a chat function. Do use it. I think it's one of the great things about online conferences is you can chat to each other without disturbing people who are listening to the speakers. So feel free to do that. And most importantly, pop your questions in there, and I'll try and get to those at the end. By way of introduction, we're going to look at both new neighbourhoods and existing neighbourhoods in this session. I think we're at probably something of an inflection point in living memory, which is that for the next couple of decades, the big money is going to go into retrofitting existing neighbourhoods, whereas it's been the other way around. It's all been about new neighbourhoods historically. So that'll be an interesting change for us to discuss as we go through. I'm also going to, just to give people forewarning, I am going to ask people about whether they've heard of the UN's Race to Zero campaign and whether they've signed up to it when we get to the end. I'll put a link to that in the chat if anyone wants to have a look, but give people due warning. Okay, so we've been joined by John Coleman, who's Chief Exec of the Land and Development Agency, which I think probably fair to say, John, you come from, I'll call it a landowner perspective. I know it's probably much bigger and wider than that, but as distinct from being a direct developer. But feel free to expand on that intro, and now over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to everyone who's dialing in, and thanks to the Academy for inviting me along to speak today. Yes, Chris, I am coming from the perspective of a landowner, but also more broadly a developer and of housing as well. That we have a number of schemes in the offing at the moment that we probably deliver directly, and also from obviously it's an evolving policy context, an evolving institutional context, and but also from our own perspective as a new agency trying to bake in sustainability measures and the sustainability agenda into how we do things. So it's a really interesting time for us in this space, and happy to talk to you a little bit about our views on things. So in my presentation, which I'll share now, I'll just give you a little quick whistle-top tour of the LDA, where we've got to date, just our broad view on the sustainability agenda, what that means for us on a practical level for project base, and also from a governance base as well, and how do we measure, how do we monitor, how do we invoke this. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I hope that can be seen.
That's perfect, John, thanks.
So obviously we have the snapshot of the context that we're in Ireland, anyway, from an economic perspective, and the wider housing agenda. So rents on the up, not enough apartments. This is kind of going anti-clockwise at the graphs here. Not enough apartments, construction costs flying high. Obviously it's not a uniquely Irish problem, and production still pretty low in comparison to what it was 10 years ago, which is probably no bad thing, but not nearly high enough either. So you know, we've a bit of a perfect storm at the moment and challenges from everywhere. So the LDA, we started from nothing about 3 years ago. We're currently on sites that could yield around 6,000 homes, but there's been a commitment from government to transfer an additional 15,000 homes worth of land, if you like. And I think they're the really big opportunities, those longer term, larger scale ones where we can really drive master planning, efficiency of design, and some of the sustainability metrics that we're going to invoke, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so what's the LDA doing? It's doing two things really. It's delivering mainly affordable homes on state lands in the short term, as quickly as we can through a number of ways. And also in the longer term, this active land manager role, this land assembly role. So to draw a red line around very large scale strategic areas for putting together not just a design and master planning solution, but also an implementation plan. We'll talk about that again in a moment. So in the 3 years since we set up, our site portfolio has grown significantly. We're on some of these kind of land assembly plays, about 6 of those at the moment, at least 3 of which are quite significant, even in a broader European context, I would say, just due to their scale. Where we're underperforming a little bit because of challenges in the planning system in Ireland is on live planning permissions, but we're working hard to try and convert some of those 26,000 into consented. So the wider policy framework is really driven by the National Development Plan in Ireland. Housing for All is the kind of sub-plan that deals with the housing strategy over the next 10 years. So what that means for the LDA is a reasonable amount of capital to achieve our objectives, transfer for lands, which I've mentioned, but also we've got the nod to try and work with the private sector to deliver affordable homes on consented land that hasn't got going for one reason or another. That's nicknamed Project Tusig, which is the Irish for start or initiate. So really affordable housing delivery is our shorter term focus, but the longer term bigger picture for the LDA when it's going to be measured over time will be the land assembly piece. It's complementary, I guess, to other national development plan investments around climate change in particular, but also what's quite interesting to us is transport, and transport oriented development is high on our agenda. So the national strategic objectives that are developed further out in the National Development Plan are listed there. But really, the point I'm just trying to make here with this slide is that they're all interconnected, and they all do point very strongly towards more sustainable development and sustainable communities going forward. Where did the LDA get inspiration for what we were setting up for what we would be? We were very much launched as a concept, and I guess none of these are directly the exact same or carbon copy of the LDA concept, but we've drawn in elements from them all, particularly Homes England and Transport for London, which both worked with the market to deliver affordable housing and also utilised its own land for the delivery of affordable housing as well, respectively. So they were big influencers, I guess, as we were forming the LDA mandate. So when we think about sustainability, it is climate change, of course, but it's not just that. It's general sustainability. So that's around community sustainability as well. And what did I mean around that? It's around mixed tenure developments and increasing. We've a very polarized market at the moment. Is either social housing or private, one or the other. You qualify for everything or qualify for nothing. And we're trying to work this new tenure affordable housing, new to Ireland, that is, into the equation, particularly with cost rental. So that we think that will make for sustainable communities. I mentioned transport-oriented development. We're working with the transport companies, our partners there, to try and maximize and leverage the transport nodes that they have on their land. We want to build to density, which I'll talk about a little bit further in a moment. And but we also want to, on the design and implementation piece, we want to deliver the to a high energy efficiency. And actually, our first scheme, which we're out to tender at the moment with a contractor, is designed to passive house standard. I believe it'll be the largest passive house development in Europe when built. So our current site portfolio, the little house icons denote kind of infill planning and infill development opportunities. The skyscraper icons denote the strategic areas, which I mentioned earlier. Just to give you an example of what each of those relates to. I mean, we've a number of schemes, all state lands at the moment, but St. Kevin's Hospital in Cork is a former mental health institution that was burnt out, derelict, blight on the horizon in Cork. It's quite conspicuous. So we just got planning permission for about 265 homes. We're going to go on enabling works early in the new year on that, deliver them entirely as social and affordable, and achieving a reasonable density on that. Shangana Castle, similarly, it's around 600 homes in partnership with the local authority, Dunleary-Rathdown County Council. And again, the sustainability of community piece is the mix of social and affordable there, which is promoting the sustainable communities, but also the design standards themselves, very airtight and designed to passive house standard and utilizing a centralized heating system. And just a little bit more detail on the Shangana scheme there. So this is about delivering sustainable communities today. And I guess the tagline there is passive house, and the certification of that, I think it's going to be very interesting, and we hope to commence construction early next year on that. But there's also a number of green corridors and a lot of amenity green space as well that's included, which is going to make it quite a nice livable area to live. So that's today, but in the longer term, I think is really the big opportunity for the LDA and sustainability. I mentioned that we have kind of drawn a red line around a number of areas within Irish cities that of their own could be transformational in the city context. So we've taken inspiration from a number of places further afield, which I'll talk about now. But some of the imagery that you see there is top left, working clockwise, Cork, Docklands, which is that's right bang in the middle of or abuts the CBD in Cork, that coloured area. Limerick Colbert Station right in the centre of Limerick, that's the main train station in that image on the design review, which I'll mention now. The digital hub in Dublin beside the St. James's Gate Brewery, Guinness Brewery, which is also under redevelopment, and then an area in Galway called Sandy Road. So our approach to these has been generally to work with the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland to bring in architects, perform a bit of a blue sky exercise called a design review. That comes out with high level ideas, and then to further ratify those and draw those out in a form of a master plan, which we've called a spatial framework, which positions us for consultation, and then we can look to pick off opportunity sites for development and planning applications. So we got some of the ideas for this concept, similar scale. I mean, many of the people here will know about these. Hafen City in Hamburg and Nordhaven in Copenhagen share elements of what we're talking about. All state lands relied on transport infrastructure, were long-term projects, but were designated areas and master planned and proper governance structures put around them to deliver them. So that's the exact same type of concept that we're trying to invoke with our strategic areas as well. Slightly closer to home, the UK, and just one I'll mention by one of our friends in RKD Architects, King's Cross in London, obviously leveraging train yards and formerly kind of half derelict areas to bring forward a new rejuvenated area live work propositions. And RKD Architects, an Irish architectural firm, recently won a competition in respect of ideas for affordable housing in Sunnyside in Queens in New York, which is the largest, I think it's disused train yard in America, but you know, these are all quite relevant, quite inspirational for us. So this is Limerick. It's probably our most advanced version of the strategic area concept that we've learned from further afield. It's about 50 hectares. So the state owns all the land. It's the local authority, it's the transport companies and the health provider. Interestingly, the transport companies actually are very happy to work with us because they want to kind of build the activity and business around the central train station there, and are quite supportive, I have to say, as is the local authority in terms of what we want to achieve there. So it's trying to create a new live-work proposition to attract investment, but employers and occupiers, but to do it in a sustainable way, focusing on a modal shift away from cars. We have designed in a spine connecting all the districts that are outlined there, called the Limerick Link, which is a pedestrian, elevated pedestrian and bicycle lane that goes right through the site, and we think can eventually be iconic in bringing all the various parts of it together, but really focused on driving away from car usage into more sustainable modes. There's an extract from the spatial framework or the master plan that we produced, and kind of shows the Limerick Link in red, which is an interconnecting factor, taking it into the old city, but also joining up the new part as well. There's a significant focus on green spaces too. So maintaining the existing biodiversity and improving it is a key objective. But obviously try to balance that with sustainable developed and dense development as well, which we want people to do. One of the other kind of project level concepts that we've been discussing and advancing as well, we have this constant battle in Ireland about height, and height is generally unpopular. And we're trying to go and work with the concept that you can still have good densities without height. So one of our schemes, particularly Balbriggan, it's called North Dublin. It's about 800 homes that we're advancing through the planning system at the moment, but we're promoting the idea of the homestead, what's called the homestead suburban development, where it's shared spaces, but it's more dense, more uniform typologies, and rather than the traditional suburban kind of spread out big gardens. And so we think we can achieve quite good densities without necessarily going high, almost comparable to apartment densities at the upper end. This is an extract from that homestead model. The developer model in Ireland would typically try to concentrate to achieve densities over a wider site. It will concentrate very high density in one corner of the site, while the more commercially viable, cheaper to build house typologies will be spread then more sparsely throughout the site. So we're trying to achieve a more uniform densification through the site with mid-density typologies, and it's kind of set out there what we refer to as homestead. So as you can see, I think it's quite an attractive and inoffensive development form. A lot of shared space, and it's obviously compact and dense enough, but not too dense. And that's just another artist rendering of it. But the interesting thing about it is there's a number of areas in Dublin that are kind of built 100 years ago along these lines. This is one called Mount Brown in Kilmainham, which I think is in and around 70 to the hectare in terms of density. So maybe the Victorians or Edwardians didn't have it all wrong from a planning perspective either. So just from a governance perspective and how we implement all of this and make sure that we're measuring ourselves against it. So we have, as I mentioned, national strategic outcomes from the National Planning Framework, which is the wider planning governing framework. They flow into our own policies as a government body, and we are identifying metrics and governance to ensure that we measure ourselves against them. So we're a new agency, we're still developing these, but how we're going about it is that the National Planning Framework flows down through the LDA and the LDA Bill, which is now the LDA Act, and it gives a statutory requirement to have a sustainability policy, which is implemented through the Board of Directors, and we do have a strategic planning and sustainability subcommittee which deals with all of these matters. And then we have a separate strategic planning unit which comes up with policies and implementation aspects as well through design standards. So that's broadly our governance framework to oversee this. The Irish Green Building Council is promoting the Home Performance Index, which we have just adopted as an internal measurement ourselves, and is a very broad sustainability measurement tool, which we're applying retrospectively to developments that we're already on, but also developments that we're going to assess, and whether we go or no-go decision happens in relation to them. So this is baked into our internal processes so that we can assess and measure. And hopefully that gives you a sense of our universe of activity, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but also in terms of how we're going to administer it and implement it going forward. So thank you very much for listening to me.
John, thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. And as you say, decidedly whistle stop. There were some lovely precedent images in there that I think a lot of people in the audience will have probably visited and certainly have a lot of time for. And then what you've done with those in look really good. So thank you very much. I suspect I've certainly got a number of questions, but we'll save those up to the end. And thanks for staying within the time. That makes my life a lot easier. We'll move on now to Eleanor Warwick, who I like to regard as a friend, someone who's doing some fantastic work in all kinds of different parts of the housing world, to be honest. Head of Strategic Policy and Research at Clarion, and every word in my experience that she says is worth listening to. So Eleanor, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. What a lovely introduction. And thank you, John. That was absolutely fascinating. I hadn't realised that you were just beginning to get to grips with affordable rents. I will, having experienced it for over a decade here, one of the first things that I investigated when I showed up at Clarion, which was then sort of Affinity Sutton, was looking at who was ending up actually living and paying affordable rents out of the sort of like pool of residents that we have, and it isn't the people who you would actually immediately have targeted for sort of like that intermediate sort of like tenure, and it's really interesting because I think we're beginning to reconsider some of those rental levels that have been set, and certainly our latest GLA sort of like funding out of the 2,000 homes we've got sort of like funding from them, 1,250. I guess just about are going to be sort of like social rent levels. So I can share some research, which will be really exactly the reason why this sort of like event is so useful. So yes, as Chris sort of like said, I head up the policy and research team at Clarion. What I'm going to be talking about, even though my title sort of like said, retrofitting for quality of life, it's very much going to be trying to keep a people sort of centric view, which is why it was a pity to have missed sort of like Helen's talk, because I think her title, People Powered Retrofit, is absolutely perfect. I'm going to be talking about how we scale up that sort of like challenge of going from individual pilots and the sort of like the small scale sort of like activity we're doing through the sort of like larger estate regeneration, to actually looking at our existing homes and the neighbourhoods they are, to this idea of net positive neighbourhoods. Let's move on. Is that moving on? Does everybody see the next slide?
No, not yet.
Well, it's taking a bit of time. It's saying advance to the next slide. I press the button. There. Okay. It's taking a bit of time. So a little bit about Clarion. Clarion is England's largest housing association. We've been around for 100 years. We have 175,000 homes across the country, and about 1/3 people are calling a Clarion property their home. We have, homes, as I said, sort of like at social rent, at affordable rent. We develop shared ownership and homes for sale to cross-subsidise our sub-market sort of like houses, which is really, really critical. And I think that sort of like really brings up that tension that housing associations are really sort of like struggle with. This whole sort of like position of having affordable rents, being a landlord, providing homes that people can actually really afford. The position we've been put into developing sort of like new builds and being able to sort of like pay for that. The mess that we're having to sort of like deal with building safety and some of the other sort of like really huge sort of like calls on our funding that we have. and now we have sort of like retrofit. And so I think that's really we're trying to sort of like square a circle in lots of different ways. I wanted to sort of like say a little bit about Clarion's sort of like tripartite approach to sustainability at the moment, because it starts to sort of show how we are trying to, I guess, balance that idea of the retrofit that we need to do against the new build investment, particularly when we're meeting net zero carbon targets. And you know, this sort of like real sense that I've got that you know, we have been sort of like premising net zero via new homes, and we really have to be focusing on our existing stock far more. So Clarion, I guess there's sort of like three strands towards our sort of like sustainability framework. There is this roadmap we have for our new buildings until sort of like 2025, and you know, do go and have a look at it. It will cover all of those sort of like steps that you would really sort of like expect. You know, how we're already sort of like planning for the future home standard, the updates in Part L, and even sort of like, you know, the changes to the SAP model. We then have sort of like at the center of that, the Clarion sort of like 2040 standard. So again, this is another sort of like really hard point in time, which is, you know, giving ourselves a decade before sort of like 2050. And this is really the standard which we are going to apply to both our new build and our existing stock. So everything, that whole sort of like 175,000 homes, or however many it will be sort of like at that time. And I'll talk about the Clarion standard and the 2040 standard a little bit later on. But equally important, this third strand, I think, is actually this transparency of measurement and reporting. And I think this is going to be, this is absolutely critical for all sorts of reasons. There's the whole thing around environmental, social governance, and the way that we are raising funding to be able to sort of like afford to do all the investment that we need here. But even more importantly, there's the whole issue of building performance evaluation and how we're reducing the design and performance gap. And I'm particularly sort of like interested and concerned in how we go from BPE to sort of like post-occupancy evaluation, and making sure that actually the experience of our residents is really at the heart of everything. Okay, let's move that on. That went faster, which is much better. The benefits of whole house retrofit, and the sort of thing we spend all our time thinking about is, do you go whole hog, do you do whole house retrofit, or do you do sort of like fabric first and then sort of like think there may be follow-on phases where we can improve the sort of like technology in a plug and play way? That's the sort of thing that my colleagues and I spent all our time talking about. What I really like about this infographic, which was a UKGBC one, is that it's pulled together so many of the really positive reasons why we should be doing, you know, real deep sensible home house retrofit, and how it's going to be good for the individual household, good for the community, and excellent for sort of like, you know, the whole sort of surrounding neighborhood and sort of like city. What I want to sort of like compare that against, if that's the real reason, is, and all the reasons for it, is the big scale of the challenge that we really sort of like have. And again, if on this map you can sort of see the tiny little dots, and the tiny little sort of like green dots are all those sort of like houses below EPCC. And I think it just starts to give a sense of both the scale of the challenge that we have, and particularly this sense of looking at those areas, those really deprived areas, which is where an awful lot of this stock is really concentrated. And I guess everybody's really familiar with sort of like the scary impact of sort of like the costs. Within social housing, energy efficiency investment per household actually ranges, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between about sort of like 13k a house to 37k a house, which is why I think everybody goes, oh, it's about sort of like 20k. Let's think about it like that. And that's to bring existing stock up to EPCC. If you then scale that up to the whole social housing sort of sector, it becomes really scary in terms of sort of like funding. Savills today launched a report for the National Housing Federation, which was sort of saying to bring all social housing stock up to EPCC will cost us 36 billion. Plus, we really ought to be doing another 13 billion of solutions to actually minimise fuel poverty. These are the things which are really going to be essential. Insight Housing actually estimated that if we were going to go the whole hog for decarbonisation, really going for net zero the way that we should, it could be as much as £104 billion. And I have to sit there and think £104 billion. I can't get my head around this, but the back of the envelope calculation is that you could pay the rent for all social housing tenants in England for 5 years for that sort of scale of investment. And you always have to sort of like keep that in mind when we hear announcements from the government, like yesterday, of the sort of like, you know, the 1.9 billion, you know, for the next 4 years going into it, and how can we make sure that we're actually going to get multiple year-on commitments, because this is a big job we've got to do. So looking at where the funding for money is, and we are incredibly grateful, of course, for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and all the investment that BEIS is putting. Like many other housing associations, we've got a couple of pilots here. We're getting 1.4 million from the fund, and we're match funding that. And for that, we have two schemes in different places, which we're using sort of like as comparisons. We have 80 homes we were intending to retrofit in Fenland, in Wisbech Beach, and for these, they're a real spread of ages. We had 13 sort of like archetypes. The thing that's really important about these, they're all EPCD, all there, is that we've got 30,000 similar dwellings across the country which are in a similar sort of like condition of this. So immediately, whatever we learn in these sort of like, you know, these homes here, we could scale up. The second part of our pilot is homes in Tonbridge and Malling. And as you can see, these are 1960s Wimpy's no fines. And they've got really, really specific sort of like problems. And so although we only have 700 of these sort of like similar sort of like dwellings, there's still 40,000 of these across the UK, and they're a real pain, and they're really sort of like difficult to sort of like start to sort of like concentrate on. We're pressing on. We're doing sort of like really well. This is some of the earlier the Wisbech sort of like schemes which have already been here. We've got learning coming in already from the early completed homes. If anybody was watching Sky News on Monday, they were talking to some of the residents who were already claiming that they were starting to see some sort of like energy savings. We will see. I guess the lessons that are sort of like coming back. The first ones, you may have noticed we had a plan for sort of like 160 units. We've actually had 115 residents agreeing to the programme, and it's 12 weeks of sort of like disruption. One of the things that we really need to understand is why. Where is this sort of like reticent? What's the things we need to do? We have all the things about the targets that we've sort of like set ourselves. Are we actually achieving all the model savings? What's actually happening with the emissions? How are things sort of like going? BEIS is being really good in terms of making sure that we're collecting all the data for that. However, we felt it was really important that there's sort of like the wider information that we collected about the local economy. So this thing about this estimation of the new jobs and apprenticeships that we were sort of like including. So I think there's additional things that we can be learning. And we've got a really nice program which is coming out from sort of like the learning from these sort of like pilots. That's partly monitoring long-term outcomes for residents. And again, there's some really practical things like, you know, we are doing so many air tightness tests. It's going to be phenomenal. So much sort of like data which is coming through from that. One of the things we're starting to think about, and we've got the bid already in, you know, for the next sort of like wave, is the first specification I think was quite Rolls-Royce. And you know, the level of investment, even with government funding, it's quite high, and it's not going to be sort of like necessarily sustainable, or one we could roll out across all of those sort of like properties that we have like that. So I think there's a lot of thinking going on about what is it about the specification. You know, hopefully there will be economies of scale, but how can we do that? Because I think that history of retrofit programs in the past is partly where pilots actually falter, and it depends not just on sort of like, you know, the subsidies and the subsidies stopping, but the established supply chains of being able to sort of like deliver. So there's some very, very practical things we're looking at. The aim, though, was really how do we sort of like scale up and improve the cost effectiveness of all of those. And we had a bid into a Horizon 2020 funding for a big research. And the reason you've got the miserable face is because we didn't get the funding for that research project, but we still need to be looking at it. And this was very much about how we can use strategic data, the digitizing of the buildings and the programs, to make a shift from single projects to a big portfolio of homes. So it's using the data as the foundation for building passports, and actually real organizational decarbonisation roadmaps, really using the data to drive that. To scale up, we're going to need real confident financial decision making, and talking to our investors, that's the sort of, that level of information is what they're really keen on, because it's this idea of we have to be able to have no regrets interventions. What we can't afford to do is getting locked into programs of changes, going through all the disruption with our residents, and then it proving to be sort of like insufficient. So this slide is to sort of like remind me that we need to have that debate about the embodied carbon and pulling buildings down or sort of like building new, particularly around sort of like estate generation. And it was a real pity to have missed Nick's sort of like talk about who decides what gets kept and what gets sort of like demolished. And I think I'm not going to go into that now because I don't have the time. But one of the ways that we've really started to think about estate regeneration is being able to sort of say there will be these decisions, but we also about carbon, but we also need to be really, really aware of the social and environmental sort of, and in economic, I should say economic rather than environmental benefits, and the local sort of like economic benefits that we can be generating. Which then leads me on to this other great project that we were involved with UKGBC, which was looking at where are those wider neighbourhood benefits to sort of like communities, because I think the brutal reality is we can get the pilots right, but home retrofit won't actually regenerate communities. We need to have a real clear vision for the improvements to the local area, which can be undertaken alongside retrofit works, so that the delivery of sort of like the retrofit, the home retrofit, acts as a catalyst for improvements to the whole sort of like area. And this touches on things I've talked about before, like local supply chains, energy storage, making sure there's working there, sort of ensuring that whole home retrofits actually are working in a way that people sort of like really want them to. And that then leads us on to this sense of how do we have, what levels of standards are we really sort of like expecting, and how can we have standards which work holistically at a neighbourhood level. These are the headlines, the nine characteristics for our Clarion's 2040 standards. And as I said, this is both going to be for our new and existing homes, and we have some sort of like real baselines that any home that we have can't go below SAP 72. That's only sort of like C at the moment. But I think the point I wanted from these 9 points is that it's got to be more than just energy efficiency. It's got to be feeling safe. It's got to be sort of like having the space that actually you need. We need to be committed to investing in quality components. The homes have to have sort of like the right long-term financial performance, which again comes back to, are the homes we're providing genuinely going to be sort of like affordable? And this issue then of the right homes in the right places, within neighbourhoods and places where people actually really want to live. And where we are at the moment, and this is why it says the neighbourhood standard, is we're working on a process for really establishing how do we go from having a generic neighbourhood standard to a very robust process working with these existing residents to make sure that what we have is a bespoke local offer for them. What's really needed. Okay, I will press on sort of like through that, and it's very much about saying how do you make things bespoke? How do we work with the people who are actually living in a community, who know what is actually sort of like needed? Did you say 1 minute or?
Yeah, just one.
Okay, well then I'll rattle through this, because everybody here will be really familiar with all the sort of like the tools and the approaches that we actually have been used, and how we can sort of like use the, I guess, work with residents to develop a framework that we can work with them to come up with the idea of what they actually need. And again, this is, you know, we've had over the summer workshops with over sort of like 100 residents, where we are getting them to really think about the places where they what they want and what those standards should really be, and most importantly, how we can translate that into action plans so we can prioritize and deliver the sort of like the retrofit and the reuse of the places that they really want to need. So a lot of this is we can have a plan that wanting our estates and places to be fit for the future, but we need to make sure that they get the targeted investment that they need. Okay, I have 2 more slides and I will rattle through them really, really quickly. Again, I think this was picking up on Chris's point at the very beginning. We've spent a lot of time over the last sort of like decade thinking about new places and new towns and new settlements and new codes. We are really committed to the way that sort of like new design codes sort of like might help. But I think we need to start thinking a bit smarter, and this table from Joe Williams actually starts to remind us of all the different types of codes that can exist and sort of like can be used. And I think the National Model Design Code starts to think for new build of the retrofit, the zero carbon sort of like elements we need to have. We need to devise a way, and this is what we're trying to do in the Clarion neighbourhood standard, to be able to retrofit those into existing places. My final slide. Okay, so the message, I guess, from what I've said is retrofit's hard. Reaching net carbon, not just sort of like, you know, the standard of EPCC, is hard. Scaling up from individual projects whilst keeping residents at the heart of that is even harder still. But I think if, like Clarion, you're serious about placemaking for communities over the long term, we have to be thinking and doing more. So I want to leave you with this idea that I think we need to be thinking beyond sort of like net carbon to a net positive sort of like agenda. So rather than limiting our actions to doing less bad, to sort of like reduction, to how we can have a positive impact, to be regenerative, to generate value, to create, to enhance and restore. And as soon as you start to talk about generating value, that sits really well with regeneration and even our sort of like developer colleagues. So I think it's bringing this all into this sort of like holistic approach. Net positive is about creating a surplus, so it's adding back more than was there in the beginning. It's not just 10% more biodiversity, but from that image that I had, to go from a rundown estate where everyone wanted to leave to a place where people really were keen to live there, to bring their kids up there and to invite neighbours into their homes, which are warm and decent and places they can be really proud of. And I will finish there.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I'm not sure whether I should thank you for adding another 30-page report to my net zero reading list, which is hundreds of pages long just in the last 48 hours. But that was great. Thank you very much indeed. We'll move straight on to a double act. Wesley Wroe and Josh Grantham from Stantec, both with dirty hands in the real life delivery of neighbourhoods. Wesley beforehand, Josh, I don't think you heard this. Wesley assured me that you did an on-stage comedy double act on a regular basis. So I'm sure we're all really looking forward to hear you. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Chris. Sorry, I was just trying to figure out how to turn myself off mute and the camera on while also sharing the screen. Life, eh? Thanks, everyone, and thanks to the speakers that went before us. We're both really pleased to be presenting today. My name is Wesley, and I'm with my colleague Josh, who is also on screen at the moment. We're both civil engineers by training, we work with Stantec, but our focus really is on the delivery of sustainable urban infrastructure. And we're going to talk a bit about what that means in this presentation, catchily titled "Recycling the Street." So, just to check, has that slide moved on? Is it still working okay? Yeah, great. So we're going to go through firstly a bit of an introduction into the idea of streets and the infrastructure that holds our buildings and our neighbourhoods together. So a bit of a shift away from what some of the other speakers have been talking about today, and really why we want to think about sustainable streets. Josh is going to talk in a bit of detail about a project that we've been working on with Suffolk County Council over the last 18 months, looking at their streets design guide. And then I'll go through a bit of a worked example of how we apply these principles to a real life setting and start to rethink the way our existing road networks can function. So first off, sustainable streets. Well, ultimately a street is the mesh that holds together the built environment, and it's through the delivery of sustainable streets that we can help to build a more sustainable communities. So really at the heart of this is we need to move away from thinking about roads as routes to convey vehicular traffic, which is traditionally what we think about roads doing, and instead thinking of streets as networks of pedestrian, cycle and public transport routes that we permit access to cars where necessary. And that's the shift in thinking that we need to be making as designers.
So where are we at the moment, and what are the negative consequences of a bad street? A lot of estate road design came off the back of Design Bulletin 32, which kind of gave a lot of the structure to the way that we develop streets in new developments. So it kind of lay homage to the 6-meter radiuses, the verges, the footways to the side, and that kind of car dominance. And that's kind of resulted in the past 50 years in the cul-de-sac developments, the out-of-town shopping, the complete reliance on car ownership, and the poor use of space and lack of character. And we still see that kind of blockage coming through. Design Bulletin 32 is still referenced by certain highway authorities, and it's taken a long time for some of the new thinking to kind of break through.
So thinking first at the very high level from a kind of a policy perspective and the transport planning and what sets the scene for what we end up delivering is, currently our model is based on this idea of predict and provide. So we use all manner of clever models to try and understand, based on however many people we think are going to move into an area because of the developments happening, what sort of impact that's going to have on the local road network, and therefore how much bigger we need to make the roads, how many new roundabouts we need, where we need traffic lights, all these sorts of things that end up making larger and larger bits of road network. And we move from that to a kind of this idea of vision and validate, and actually saying, well, the local area, through policy documents, has a vision for what they want the neighborhood to look like, and we as designers have a role in making that vision happen. And actually, rather than saying, well, we know that 100 new houses is going to generate X number of car trips, we want to say, well, there's 100 new houses, and therefore we're going to put in really high quality cycle infrastructure and a new bus route, and it actually encourage people away from their cars and onto more healthy and sustainable modes of transport, and therefore kind of create the future that these visions have set out.
So as Wesley said at the beginning, we've been working with Suffolk for the last 18 months, and we originally came on board to rewrite their highway design guide, which the first thing we did was change the name of it to a street guide. And we kind of wanted to help the kind of engagement process of the highway engineers and pull this document more central to a planning referenceable document for everybody involved, and getting away from that kind of concept of just thinking in highways. To summarize quite a large document, we basically, during our literature review, found a disconnect from the user's first approach. So that's putting pedestrians and cyclists first, which is, something really positive that's come out of, Manual for Streets, kind of mentioning it 15 years ago. But we found that it still wasn't being taken through to design. So we effectively wanted to break the vehicular hierarchy and put users first and create a methodology for doing that. So we basically did that by what you've got on the left is pretty typical kind of hierarchy of roads that you might have seen in a design guide previously or in codes. So private drives, shared streets, tertiary streets, all the way up to primary streets, etc. And we wanted to basically just kind of ban that thinking and make sure that we're putting routes in that kind of focus on that user's first approach. So asking people to create primary routes for pedestrians, cyclists, then vehicles. And I'm just going to go through a quick work example of how that all meshes together. So starting by pedestrians, we're thinking about what's the existing infrastructure, how are we thinking outside of the red line boundary, public rights of way, for instance. And we're basically asking designers to come along and create primary and secondary routes. Really simple, but we're creating a nice tight web of routes. And then we go on to cycling routes. We've got lots of new documents to reference from here. We still need to think about how that fits within the existing context and within the context of Suffolk. So understanding the existing infrastructure probably isn't much. And then creating, again, that web of primary and secondary routes. And you'll see why the primary and secondary hierarchy becomes quite important. Public transport is a slightly different beast because we need to think about the public transport routes. They kind of set the tone for how we should be thinking about primary vehicular corridors. So where are our bus stop locations going? And then second to that, just going back through stages 1 and 2 and referencing and checking that our cycling and walking networks are set up to align with kind of the transport network. And then finally, we're thinking about vehicular routes. For the private car and access and a few other things. Now we've got 3 hierarchies here. We're only showing primary and secondary, but there's primary, secondary, and access. And the access gives us a way to prioritize the other users over vehicular traffic. So we're only showing primary and secondary here, and you can see the kind of density of those routes is significantly lower from that pedestrian route. And then we mash all this together and we create movement corridors. And through creating movement corridors, we can understand intersections. And this is intersections with new streets and existing streets. So for instance, movement corridor 2, if you can remember the old slide, is an existing corridor that we're putting new users on. We basically go through that process of designing for each user in that road corridor. So movement corridor 3, with a couple of steps in the middle, you can see it in the top left, basically can translate into a movement corridor like this, where we understanding for the users within each setting. So for instance, here we know we've got a primary ped cycle route east to west, and it's crossing a secondary vehicular route north to south. So we have to make sure the design cues are right to ensure that that priority is actually carried through. So from the concept of users first all the way through to the design. And I'll hand back over to Wes.
Thank you, Josh. So we're going to just take that same kind of process and principle a step further and look at an example from a real city. So this is in Cambridge, close to where our office is. We've got Newmarket Road, which is one of the main arterial roads that links into Cambridge, taking you out towards Newmarket and then to Ely. And it's a pretty typical Cambridge urban environment, you know, I suppose looking fairly suburban to people that are more familiar with the bigger cities. But you know, we've got our overlay on here, this same principle. So we're now thinking, you know, running through the middle here, we've got our primary vehicular route, but it's also a primary pedestrian and cycle route through this middle section linking into the city. And then we've got a secondary vehicle route looping around here, you know, connecting to everything else that's going on. So we've got, you know, various non-residential aspects, a bit of an industrial estate up here, some shops and other things, and then linking into the kind of the actual access routes into the residential properties themselves. But what we do is where we call these access for vehicles, these still form our secondary routes for pedestrians and cycles, because actually when you get into these environments, you know, close to the home, the priority always should be to those who aren't in cars. And that's how this kind of hierarchy approach helps us to start looking at that. So I've got 2 examples down here of junctions that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail to see how, you know, we can start to change existing street design to work better with this hierarchy. So the first one we're looking at our primary pedestrian, cycle and vehicle route through here, linking into an access to a small block of flats. And then the second one, we've got our primary vehicle, pedestrian and cycle, linking to our secondary vehicle and pedestrian and cycle route. So this first one here that we're looking at, it's pretty typical for an access into a small residential estate. So we've got nice large radiuses on the bell mouth. We've got drop curbs taking the pedestrians down to street level to cross. We have, as you can see, in this case, we do have mandatory cycle facilities, although they're pretty poor quality, just delineated with with old white lines that haven't had much love in a while. And as you can see in the verges, we've got a nice bit of informal parking to block everyone's visibility of each other. But ultimately,
couple more minutes, please, guys.
Yeah, no problem. We can then look at a bit of a transformation of this route through here and actually take a lesson from our European friends and adopt an approach of using these continuous footpaths. And actually through removing the radiuses on here and keeping the pedestrians level through the crossing. And in this example, we're not showing the cycle facility, but you've got the cycle facility along the front. You can completely change the way that the street is used and give the priority to the pedestrians for whom this is a primary route over the vehicles who are just gaining access through here. And an example from Amsterdam of how we see this delivered in the real world shows just how much of the street space we can win back for pedestrians and cyclists. All this space in the middle, which traditionally would have been carriageway. So we'll look at one final example, which is the second point where we're linking onto a secondary access route. And again, you can see in the existing scenario, our cycle facility is completely lost over the junction. We've got a fairly substandard refuge island for pedestrians and some pretty faded 20-mile-an-hour signs going in. And what we can do here, and again, this is taking a design example from LTN 120 as an approach, which is our latest cycle design guide, is actually on our main road. When the cars take the turning, we set back our crossing for pedestrians and cycles, give them priority to continue across here, and actually allow space for the cars to give way and be fully facing the pedestrians and cyclists. So you've got good visibility in both directions. And so a car is instructed to stop and give way to those crossing over here. And through design like this, we can make sure that we're really enshrining the priority of the way that these users are behaving, making sure that pedestrians and cyclists and the more vulnerable users get priority at these crossings, and really doesn't take a huge amount more street space than what we currently have. And there's lots of great examples coming up in urban environments of how this sort of design is getting worked in. So I think as a closing slide, we've got a few top tips to leave you with. So, firstly, we want to stop thinking about primary, secondary and tertiary streets and start thinking about the different users and how they fall within the hierarchy and who we're designing for. Design in priority at the site at all scales. So for each of those different elements we've looked at, and obviously there are many more, and ultimately be flexible with the sort of elements that we're using to tackle these challenges. There's loads of great examples of how you convey pedestrians and cyclists and how you deal with junctions that are much more creative than a lot of the junctions that we typically see in our urban environments. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for listening.
Not enough time for any of our jokes, unfortunately.
We'll get onto that in the Q&A, guys. Thank you very much. That was fantastic and really uplifting. Can we unshare the slide, Wesley? Fantastic. We're all back on now. I think I saw Jonathan sneak into the room earlier. So if Josh and Wesley could disappear and Jonathan could switch on his camera and microphone, just check that you're there.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
It's a bit faint and echoey, Jonathan, so if you can get as close to the mic as possible, that'd be great. Jonathan's development director at Citu, who are, they've been around for a while, but I like to think of them as one of the new breed of up and coming developers who really take sustainability seriously. There's an increasing number now, and Citu have got some fantastic schemes already on the ground. So Jonathan, over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you for such a kind introduction. Can you all see that? Or can you see that?
We can. We're still seeing the bar on the right-hand side of the PDF.
Yeah. Let's sort that out now. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Fabulous. So first, and of course, thank you very much for inviting me to such a forum. I think it's we thoroughly enjoy being part of anything to do with the Academy of Urbanism. So thank you very much. I guess following on from the introduction and just a quick introduction to ourselves. We're a POPIC developer. We're based over in Leeds, and our developments are all in the Yorkshire region. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the developments that we're actually just finishing the first two phases over at Little Kelham in Kelham Island, and talking about the delivery and reuse over in Little Kelham. I think it's absolutely worth pointing out that Kelham Island, where the site's located, was voted the greatest neighbourhood in the UK in 2018 by the Academy of Urbanism. So first and absolutely foremost is about who we are and what it is we do. We're a completely purpose-led business. Everything we do is aligned to this purpose, which is to accelerate the change to zero carbon places. And we don't have a purpose that is stuck in our waiting room and something that we very rarely connect with. This is something we connect with on a daily basis. It's how we make our decisions. It's how we design our places. So the reason we exist, aligned to our purposes around the climate crisis, we take the responsibility of what we see as humanity's greatest challenge incredibly seriously as a business. We take it seriously in every part of what we do as a business, and continuous improvement, learning, sharing, and as I'll come on to shortly, sort of breaking that status quo is the key ingredients to making that happen. Little Kelham itself, so what it is we're doing here, Little Kelham is, there's approximately 250 new homes, and we're bringing back into reuse 50,000 square foot of existing buildings that I'm going to talk about today. Just a quick point on how we do that, and I guess one of the reasons we have been around a long time and are now sort of, there's a lot more awareness around what we're doing, is that we've spent the last 7 years building the business. We're still very much a scaling up business, but we've been building the model to deliver what we want, what we see as achievable, which is about creating substantial, sustainable places at scale, and being able to do that with a market face. So Little Kelham, we acquired way back in 2015. It was an old redundant brownfield site. It was part of Sheffield's red light district, and it had on the site a series of former steelworks. I think from day one on this development, the reason that we stand here today with a completed development that has won a lot of awards and sort of focus is we had a really clear vision for this place, and it was that we honoured the existing buildings. We made them part of that drive to deliver a zero carbon development that created an amazing place. But I think most importantly, this was an opportunity for us to design a place that was going to enable people to change the way in which they live in their city. As you can see from this slide, the Little Kelham, which was a forgotten part of Sheffield in lots of senses when we took on, completely changed to where we are today. But it's only a 15-minute walk to the train station. So the three components that we deal with as Citu is about the place, but it's also about the transport and the energy system. So the transport in and out of Sheffield was already there and ready made for us. So what this diagram illustrates here is the red buildings are the existing buildings that we had on site. We actually stopped a handful of these buildings being knocked down as we were acquiring the site. And I guess that often can be the status quo, particularly as from a development point of view, we get obsessed in the early stages by appraisals and what things are saying on day one, rather than taking a long-term view of the amazing places with the ingredients and the history that just simply doesn't get articulated in those early business modeling, I guess. We included and wanted to retain all the existing buildings on site to form part of that place, to form part of that story, but also to create beautiful buildings that complemented the new architecture and spaces that we were going to create on day one. I've actually thoroughly enjoyed doing this, preparing for this presentation and going right back and pulling things out. And some of the principles we had from day one was that we never compromise on the vision. That's something that we have on all our developments. And when you are trying to challenge the status quo, when you are, as you see below, trying to break the rules, you have to remake the rules. And with that comes hand in hand frustration. That frustration is something we deal with an amazing team, amazing culture within our business, and something that we'll never negotiate on, that vision. From a design perspective, removing cars from the landscape, hiding them, and asking the question if we really need it at all is our first point of call. We're not in competition with house builders, but then on the same effect, we're building a medium density place that is probably more akin to Europe. So hiding the cars and being able to tighten up those streets has been a hugely important principle that we've stuck to. And then I guess in terms of the existing buildings, it's making sure that we don't accept that they can't be improved from a performance perspective, and we challenge on that. So the ingredients we were served with on day one at Little Kelham was an amazing Green Lane Works, Eagle Works. There was the Green Lane Works has Horseman Square that offered these amazing buildings that genuinely were going to be pulled down only weeks before we stepped in and intervened during the purchase process. So so very easy, again, on a spreadsheet to remove these buildings, and particularly when you're looking at performance factors of how you improve the fabric of the building. So I guess the way in which we set out to improve these buildings is, number one, protect and respect them. And what I mean by that is the protection is obvious. These are beautiful buildings, amazing architecture, and respect in the sense of we may not be able to do everything we want to do, but if we're going to protect them, but what can we do? All of these buildings that are now in use are heated through biomass. We took a fabric first approach. We insulated from the inside of all of the buildings, and we allowed the character where it was available to still shine through. I think that it's very easy during this process to get really bogged down in the detail, particularly with Green Lane Works, which was a grade 2 listed building. And I think don't forget the design. And I think the second message we would always have is make sure we remember the people and how these people are going to use the buildings in the end. So just a few snapshots of what that looks like today is we're now leaving Little Kelham from a developer point of view, but very much we still own these existing buildings and the heart of what the development was about on day one. But combining what you can see here is shared gardens with car parking beneath, with new and the existing buildings, has been a success. And I say that as a success, not from a developer point of view or architect point of view, but from a people and place point of view. People use this space, and I regularly go down there on a weekend, and the people they're there and they're using this space how we envisaged from day one. We transformed Eagle Works into leisure. You'll have seen on the previous slides, a Sardinian restaurant that really sits in the heart of the development and is very much the heartbeat of that community. Creative spaces in those buildings that have been upgraded over time, and then living. We accept that the challenges are significantly higher in repurposing and renewing than building new, but we worked hard to make sure that we did everything we possibly could to balance the two. Green Lane Works,
please, Jonathan.
Fabulous. Green Lane Works itself is a combination of it's a residential. It's got a bar, cafe, and apartments. And similarly, the gatehouse that I presented earlier. Finally, I think it's easy to forget the materiality of these places and honouring, respecting, and where we do bring in new, making sure we find the right balance of those two. I think finally, to just conclude, is we've now moved on to the next phase of this development. Here at the bottom of the page, Kelham Central. I think if you are to set out a development of this scale and to really honour those existing buildings, I think taking a long-term view of the wider placemaking outside of that red line is hugely important. And I think just to finally conclude, I think we as professionals in the industry, we've got a huge responsibility to design our places to ignite change, but then create amazing places that people want to live without feeling the need to change too much of their day-to-day. So once again, thank you, and I will pass back over.
Jonathan, thank you so much. That was a presentation and a development after my own heart. I remember being in that part of town maybe 30 years ago when it was in the final stages of dying on its feet, and the transformation you've created has been absolutely amazing. So yeah, thank you for the work as well as the presentation. Absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
If you could stop screen sharing now, and we'll move on to Jackie Homan. Jackie's comes from a public sector background, I guess. Big chunk at Birmingham City Council, a bit elsewhere, and now at West Midlands Combined Authority. So Jackie, over to you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Sorry, I just lost my unmute button. And just to explain where I am, I'm currently sitting, I guess, in the theme of today, in the restored municipal bank in Birmingham, which has been very lovingly restored by the University of Birmingham. So there is some background noise, hopefully not too much, and hopefully you can hear me okay. So do bear with me.
We can hear you fine, Jackie. There's a bit of clearing up after lunch by the sounds of things, but otherwise great. Absolutely
lovely cafe here. Okay, so if I just pop this into slideshow, I'm almost going to helicopter back out from the presentations that we've heard today that have been really inspiring, actually, for some of the things that we're hoping to do at the West Midlands Combined Authority. And I'm Head of Environment at the Combined Authority, and I'll explain a little bit about what that is. But I'm working with a whole number of colleagues on a range of issues that have been covered this afternoon around placemaking, retrofits, and the net zero agenda. So just to give you some context, when we're talking about the Combined Authority, this is the area that we're looking at. So we have 7 constituent local authorities that you can see in the darker colours on the map. So 4 authorities in the Black Country: Wolverhampton, Walsall, Sandwell and Dudley. Birmingham, you can see there in the middle, and Solihull and Coventry. But we also work across a 3-LEP geography with the Black Country Consortium, the Greater Birmingham, the Solihull LEP, and the Coventry and Warwickshire LEP, and also with a number of non-constituent authorities around the outside. Our current mayor is Andy Street, and we have an Energy and Environment Board. The portfolio holder that leads that board is Ian Courts, and that's the political board, who's actually the leader of Solihull Metropolitan Borough Council. That's the political board that oversees the work and drives the ambition in this space. So we declared a climate emergency in June 2019, along with a whole range of local authorities, and have a net zero target for 2041. We have a number of plans in place that cut across those 4 broad areas. So climate change, and we've got a 5-year plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next few minutes, because that's driving a lot of the work we need to do around retrofit in particular. Energy, so we have a partnership called Energy Capital, who are leading on the retrofit and energy work, and also a program called the Net Zero Neighbourhood, which I'll touch on at the end, because I think that feeds quite nicely into some of the really inspiring examples we've heard this afternoon. We have a natural environment plan, so looking at natural capital, green space, widening access to green space, and thinking about how we can build that into our places across the West Midlands. And also a circular economy plan, where we're looking at things like zero waste construction, food sharing, and circular manufacturing. And we're not treating those things in silos. As you'll all know on this call, there's some real overlaps between those areas. So we work collaboratively across all 4 of those. So our 5-year plan was approved by the Combined Authority in March this year, and focuses on 5 key areas. And I'll delve into those a little bit more, but around domestic and commercial heat and retrofit, around industrial decarbonisation. For those of you who know the West Midlands, you'll know there's a big industrial heritage and also continuing industrial activity in the region, transport and mobility, and also strategic land use, where we've largely looked at large-scale renewables and tree planting and natural capital. Our first 5-year plan, which will run from this year to 2026, has a really high-level cost of 4.3 billion in terms of delivery, and we're expecting it to create 21,000 additional jobs. And this is all based on a detailed piece of research that WSP did with us to look at the potential and some of the opportunities in terms of delivering our plan. Underpinning the work that we want to do on climate change are a number of goals and principles. So we want to make sure that whatever we do is a just transition. We don't want to leave anyone behind. We want to make our places more resilient, particularly bearing in mind the climate breakdown that's already locked in. We want to use our industrial past and the heritage in the region to create a new future. And we have a whole narrative around the West Midlands as the home of the Green Industrial Revolution. We want to create places and connections, again, something we've heard a lot about this afternoon, that help us meet the climate challenge. And we want to decouple prosperity from consumption of energy and resources. And we've recently published a circular economy route map that's looking at the various ways that we can achieve that. So within the 5 areas I touched on a couple of slides ago, you can see there the breakdown of the different elements in the various categories. So in terms of domestic, we want to look at an energy efficiency retrofit, but also heating retrofit and domestic PV. And I won't run through all of those, but you can see the different elements of those 5 areas. And we're also really keen to make sure that we are addressing and picking up on a range of co-benefits that sit alongside those, whether that's around addressing fuel poverty, reducing inequalities, providing cleaner air, enhancing biodiversity. And we've linked all of these elements into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in an attempt to do that. In terms of the, I suppose, the view out to 2041, this is the scale of the challenge. So, for example, in terms of domestic retrofit, we're looking at energy efficiency in 100% of the existing homes. That's 1.1 million homes. Obviously, some of those will need more or less measures than others, but we're also looking at low carbon heating system retrofit. Similarly, you can see the scale of the challenge in commercial buildings. We have a big challenge in terms of industry, and actually some of that will require so much innovation that WSP weren't able to cost all the different elements of the transition for industry across the West Midlands. In terms of transport, we're about to review our local transport plan, and the underpinning principles for that are around avoiding, shifting and improving transport. So can we avoid travelling? If we do travel, can we shift that to lower carbon forms of travel? And how can we improve existing vehicles that are on the road, including public transports? And then you can see there the elements I talked about in terms of land use. And I think what's really important is the need to treat all of this as a system. So you can't necessarily take one element at a time, and that's something that we're looking to develop through our net zero neighbourhood work, which I'll come on to at the end. In terms of the challenge out to 2026, it's significant. So WSP considered the net zero target for 2041 and then looked at actually what does that mean to 2026. So you can see there the quantities of properties we're looking at needing to retrofit, both in the domestic and the commercial sector, the number of trees that we need to plant. These are all really big challenges, but I think what has been really good about developing the 5-year plan work is we now have the quantity, and then we can address the next steps, and we can work with our politicians on the scale of the ambition and what needs to be put in place, as well as obviously all the things that need to sit alongside this, including citizen engagement, looking for innovative financing models in order to realise the different elements of the plan. As a combined authority, obviously, we are quite limited in terms of some of the things that we're able to do. So, for example, when it comes to planning, that is a responsibility that sits with local authorities. So as we developed our 5-year plan, we were really mindful of the sort of principle of subsidiarity. So what works best at what level? What works best if you do it at scale? And so the different parts of the plan have been categorized by things we're going to be able to deliver. So a lot of that will be, for example, the local transport plan, which is a statutory document that we take responsibility for. What is it that we can enable, and what is it that we can influence, and who do we need to work with? So it's really clear that no one organisation has all the answers to the different things that we need to do, and it's going to need a partnership and collaborative approach to deliver. So coming out of those 5 areas was our response to the different things that we want to put in place. So we are establishing a smart hub for retrofit delivery and a net zero neighbourhood model, as well as a Warm Home Saves Lives programme, which will address some of the immediate concerns around fuel poverty. We're setting up a commercial task force to look at green energy, and there's a big piece of work that Energy Capital have done around devolution of energy and things like local area energy planning, and how we can take more responsibility for planning our own energy systems across the region and within local authorities. I've talked a bit about the industry and transport and land use, but I think one of the other things that's really important as we move all this work forward are things like skills, making sure we've got the right labour force in place to deliver. If we're going to be delivering retrofit at the scale that's going to be required, then that's going to need additional skills across the region. Working on behaviour change and citizens engagement, we're looking at establishing a citizens panel. We've done a lot of work with the behavioural insights team around our behaviour change programme, thinking about how we can effectively engage citizens and communities in terms of retrofitting homes, which isn't an easy hurdle necessarily to overcome. And also how we make ourselves as an organisation a carbon literate one. So how does the combined authority take all of these principles on board and build them into everybody's work as we start to deliver our net zero ambitions? And then just finally, I wanted to flag this net zero neighbourhood that I've spoken about. When we had approval of the 5-year plan, the Combined Authority Board gave us £2 million in order to seed fund the development of a net zero neighbourhood. And we're aware that this is something that we're going to have to not necessarily replicate in the same way, that we'll unpack the net zero neighbourhood box in each location across the Combined Authority, but to understand the different elements that contribute towards creating a net zero neighbourhood. So thinking about low carbon energy communities, retrofit is going to be one of the key parts of delivering the net zero neighbourhood. What financial models can we look at, and are they replicable? How can we scale this kind of delivery? So rather than individual homes being done a house at a time, there are obviously economies of scale in delivering across neighbourhoods, as we've heard this afternoon. So how can we do that? And how can we tailor different approaches to community engagement? So we're right at the start of this journey, which is why I don't have some really nice slides of some things that have already been done and put in place. But I think I've picked up so much from the presentations I've heard this afternoon on some of the things we might consider as we begin to go on this journey. The framework is currently out. I'm happy to share it amongst people on the call if anyone is interested in looking at it or coming forward with ideas. It's with all 7 of our local authorities. And whilst we might start with one neighbourhood, the idea will be to build a cohort of neighbourhoods across the Combined Authority area where we can start to work with places, with communities in order to deliver this ambition. So I just wanted to finish with my email address if anybody wants to get in touch. I don't know what's happening with slide sharing, but I'm more than happy for the slides to be shared because that is also our web address where you can find information on the 5-year plan, our natural environment plan, circular economy route map, net zero neighbourhood. It's all gathered together in this one place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was absolutely inspirational. Can I just check the net zero neighbourhood framework that you showed at the end? That's also on that web link, is it?
Yes, and if you can't find it, let me know.
That's brilliant. So everyone will be able to get that. You've also inspired some questions. So if anyone else wants to pop questions into the chat, I will try and get to them. I've got some myself, and I'll probably bob between the two. But can I start? Actually, could all the speakers pop their cameras back on so that we can see who we've got? Jonathan, if you want to. The first one I just wanted to ask. I think there's been lots of talk about the challenges particularly to retrofitting existing neighbourhoods, but also actually, we know that despite all the great examples we've seen, that some people find it very difficult to do really good new neighbourhoods. So would anyone like to offer me what they think the biggest obstacle is, either to doing great sustainable new build neighbourhoods or to retrofitting neighbourhoods for sustainability? So just one thing from each of you. Who wants to start? Otherwise I'm going to find a victim. Josh, well done.
We struggled to have pragmatic conversations about car ownership, car parking spaces associated with houses, and that kind of drives the conversation and sets like the tone of basically the land dedicated to cars is ginormous, and we really struggled to pull that back and give space back to community space, etc.
Yeah, I think that's one everyone would be familiar with. Eleanor.
I'll leap in. reason I couldn't be here this morning was because I was in a meeting looking and talking about a scheme down we've got in Richmond, which is going to be sort of like half carbon neutral and a half sort of like just above sort of like part L. And everybody keeps saying, oh, why can we not do it all? And I think the challenge, I mean, there are some sort of like cost issues there, but it's one of confidence. It's one of making sure that our residents aren't going to be guinea pigs. It's making sure that we are completely convinced that we're going to be able to do this sort of like positively. So I think it's partly confidence, and it's partly that slight sense of being so risk averse about some relatively small risks in comparison to the climate change emergency, that we're not prepared to go, you know, let's go for it. Let's be bold. Let's have the confidence that we can sort out the problems that we'll come across. So I think confidence is our biggest barrier.
Yeah, I put something in the chat right at the beginning about the UN race to zero, and I think the UN idea, it's only 17 months old, that program, but their idea there is that if everybody aligns to the same targets, they give each other the confidence, and sort of half the FTSE have already signed up, and $90 trillion of assets under management have signed up. So I think confidence is coming. It's coming from the top down, probably. John, did you want to have a crack?
I did, Chris. Thanks. Yeah, like I mean, a lot of that stuff resonates. I'll just give you some kind of recent experience, which is mainly around public engagement. And like, say for instance, the point Josh made about the car ownership stuff, like, I mean, we've got schemes where we're trying to put in very low car ownership. It's like, you know, say a third of a space per unit, that kind of ratio. And we're getting a lot of flack back from communities to say that, well, you know, just because you have no car spaces doesn't mean people don't have cars and they're just going to park everywhere else around the scheme. And so I guess to tie up the point I'm trying to make, I think it's not been able to visualize and position ourselves 10 years down the line as to when these things are going to be built. A similar issue that you might have, I mentioned one of the schemes we're designing or is built to passive house standards, and you know, we do get questioned, well, what does that mean? Oh God, you know, that's very difficult to deliver, all that sort of stuff. So there's a little bit of a leap of faith, I think, necessary, and the point there that Eleanor makes, you know, around confidence. I mean, we have to have the confidence if we are going to get there, otherwise we'll never take the steps forward. So yeah, I think that gap needs to be bridged, and we've some real live examples of that at the moment on our side of the fence.
Nicely tied together, the two previous responses. Jonathan, I see the microphone's gone off.
I'm just happy that Josh picked up on the planning problem first.
Jonathan, your audio's gone a bit weird.
Is that any better?
No, not really.
Just come back to me then, because I was just trying to sort something.
Okay, thanks. Jackie, you're setting off on this journey by the sounds of things. What feels like the biggest obstacle at the moment to you?
I think it's in some ways the scale. So looking at what has to happen and then the overwhelm. And so where do we start? So our local authorities have done some work in this space, but when you look at, you know, the scale of the challenge across the combined authority and how we try and join up different parts of financing, I think that is a particular challenge that we have. It's just, you know, let's just start.
Can I just explore one aspect of it, because we were hearing earlier about the importance of kind of bottom-up, community-led, and I know you've got some fabulous initiatives. I know particularly one that Civic Square involved with in Edgbaston. Do you see your role as kind of, you're the umbrella, but there's going to be all this activity down at community level, and somehow you've got to kind of bridge between the two?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to that slide I showed around convening and enabling. So, for example, one of the roles we've had recently is to join up some of the local authorities and RSLs around things like the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. But then when it comes to delivery, that's going to be something that happens at a different scale with people that know those communities. So yeah, that is something that we're looking at. And I know the Civic Square project really well, and the amount of community engagement they've done has been phenomenal. And that definitely needs to be done by a trusted organisation rather than someone that actually most of the people in the West Midlands have probably not heard of, to be honest.
As you say, daunting to scale it up to 1.1 million in a hurry. Jonathan, where's your mic up to?
Is that any better, Chris?
No, but keep going. We can hear what you're saying. Keep going.
I'll go as close as I can to the mic. I think, yeah, I was saying that it's luckily that Josh took over the point around parking, and so they've spoken all day about that. I think the biggest challenge for us here at Citu is about the fact that we get asked the question on a regular basis as, does sustainability cost more? And the reality to that is that it doesn't. We're a firm believer that it doesn't, but it's about how you do sustainability at a place scale. And I think the biggest challenge that we face is relating to funding. We've set up a model. We've had to build a model to be able to do things more effectively and efficiently, to be able to put that challenge back that sustainability is able to be done at scale. So I think we've ended up with a manufacturing facility, a design team. All the guys on site are employed direct by us at Citu, which means that we're ultimately trying to fund a trading business to trade with only ourselves. So I think that's probably one of our biggest challenges, outside of the usual obstacles with planning cars and the status quo. I hope you could hear that.
Yeah, no, we could. The sound got a lot better towards the end. Thanks, Jonathan. And I kind of really really understand what you're talking about. I've got a couple of questions from the audience. I don't know if you want to ask them directly. David Lum, do you want me to ask your question, or do you want to come on? Fantastic.
Hi, yeah. I don't know whether you can see me. I'm lounging on my sofa because I've got so fed up sitting at my desk. But
we can see most of you, David. That's fine. Yeah.
Most of me. Oh well, there's not a lot to me.
Crack on.
Yeah, it was just that Jacqueline's presentation on from a combined authority perspective resonated with me, because I'm an urbanist engaging at community level, bottom up community engagement, and everything we do to try and rescue our high street is if you like, it's hindered, or it's centered on the damned car. So we have to look beyond our neighborhood to why are all these cars here, and it's to do with commuting, radial routes, demographic, and it gets very complicated. But one simple thing that I've learned is in that combined authority, we're a new combined authority in Leeds. We're now 5 authorities within this even longer hierarchy of governorship we have between community and central government, but we'll not go there. My question was to Jacqueline, is the local initiative, which looks very attractive to me for all sorts of reasons we'll not go into, is the very light tram system that's being developed. And it's a classic local, if you like, bottom up, but government and local authority and community-led, business-led initiative, which is going to solve quite a few problems in terms of movement of people if it gets traction. Is that part of the vision that she's been talking about for transport and the environment in the West Midlands, and what hope does she have that it'll get traction?
David, do you just want to give everyone just a one-liner on what a very light tram is?
Well, it's like the tram systems that we're all familiar with now in Europe and Sheffield and the cities that have now developed them, but it's a smaller unit that runs more regularly on a lighter system at a fraction of the cost, but can move people around in a very efficient way. It's very difficult to. You said one line. That's best I can do.
That's perfect. Jackie, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so we do have trams in Birmingham. We also have very light rail in Coventry. So yeah, we have both of those things. what we're trying to do with the first net zero neighbourhood is align it to existing infrastructure investment around things like public transport, because those things are so many years in the planning that what we really want to do is to see where in the West Midlands, as we develop this, there is either a significant programme around new housing development or transport infrastructure. So depending on which part of the West Midlands that is, it may or may not involve the tram network. But that is being rolled out through our local transport plan, along with a whole range of other measures that our transport colleagues are looking at. And we'll try and make sure that is built into the net zero neighbourhood.
Lovely, thanks, Jackie. Nicholas, we can see, Nicholas Falk, we can see the top of your head. I see there's a question in the chat. Would you like to ask that?
Okay. I speak as an economist and I'm aware that it's finance rather than design and targets that tend to shape cities. So I want to ask whether the combined authorities need to be given the power to mobilize finance, possibly through land value capture and being able to assemble land near locations which are being upgraded with public investment. And maybe if they acted together, we might shift the treasury. Okay,
I'm going to ask Jonathan, then John, then Jackie to respond to that one. So Jonathan, what do you think? You're operating in Leeds, combined authority, getting the money together? You're on.
Yeah. If you can hear me, I think there's with all of these things, I think there's some huge positives in that, and then there's some questions, I guess. I think one of the biggest challenges still that we face, whether it's a combined authority or the authorities, is understanding of actually the amount we need to do to react to an emergency. We talk about the climate emergency, and I think before I necessarily, I think the model and the way in which we can look at these things holistically, whether that's as combined authorities or local authorities, is first we need to change the way in which we're approaching this climate emergency. I think we need to be doing it with pace. I think we need to be much bolder than we're doing. And then at that point, a combined authority to us, I think, would be a fabulous next step, a fabulous step when it comes to support, particularly as we're very much focused in the Yorkshire region. But I do think that the first thing that we need to do is to start to trigger what a real emergency looks like.
Thanks, Jonathan. John, can you give us the Irish context, which I suspect is different, but is land value capture on the radar in Ireland at the moment?
Yeah, it certainly is. There was a new housing strategy released in Ireland about 2 months ago now, Housing for All, it's called, by the government, and land value capture has been incorporated. It goes back, one thing that's often quoted in Ireland is a thing called the Kenny Report back to 1973, which was written by a judge and had fairly radical proposals in terms of essentially capturing betterment value for the benefit of the state. For land value capture, a couple of things have happened over the past couple of months. Is that firstly, the land value tax is emerging to not really value capture. It is of sorts, but the intention isn't value capture per se. It's to push development land into the hands of those that are going to develop it and penalise non-development. The second thing is there's been an increase in our social housing requirement, I guess, section 106 in the UK. It's called part 5 here. It was 10%, is now 20%. Social and affordable. I think there's a lot of scope to go higher than that if we can create an affordable housing market in the country. And the government has signalled fairly draconian value capture mechanisms, hasn't detailed them, hasn't identified them, but has signalled fairly significant land value capture mechanisms for future zoned land. So obviously it doesn't want to upset the market. If someone bought the land for 100 yesterday on the basis of certain conditions, and all of a sudden government passes a law and it's 50, we'd never get anyone to invest in housing again or land in the country. So it's going to be introduced on a phased basis. So I would have thought that could be a combination of things, either tax, but also maybe increased social and affordable requirements. But the interesting thing is, and I learned something from my UK colleagues over there for Transport for London when they looked at this wider space around land value capture to fund transport infrastructure, that most of the benefit of the increase in value went to built properties rather than vacant land around the area. So that's a tricky one, and that's one for the politicians, isn't it?
Thanks, John. That's absolutely fascinating. I do hope your government is learning from the mistakes of the UK government over many decades. I'm sorry, folks. I'm going to finish off now. Except, sorry, Eleanor.
It's all right.
Except for Jackie. Final word. Is it time that city regions combined authorities get some really decent finance raising powers to fund all your fantastic objectives?
Yes.
If you don't want to say any more, that's a perfect way to finish. We're more or less right on time. Thank you very much. You've all been fantastic speakers. The quality has been unremittingly high. I've been blown away by it. So thank you all very much for giving your time, for sharing your expertise. It's been superb. I'll pass back to Linda.
Your pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. That was an absolutely great session. And now we're going to take a break, and we're on time. So please come back at 4 o'clock. That's 4 o'clock UK time, please. Yeah, make yourself a cup of tea and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Before we disappear, Linda, could I just thank Chris for the excellent chairing of that session. Great to get so much out of it. Thank you all to the speakers, but in particular to you, Chris, as well, for handling it so well. Thank you.